I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning. Not a significant Tuesday. Not the kind of Tuesday that announces itself. Just an ordinary morning in March, 8 weeks after my husband's funeral, the kind of morning where you wake up and for 3 or 4 seconds, before the knowledge catches up with you, before the full weight of the fact of his absence settles back onto your chest where it lives now, for 3 or 4 seconds everything is fine. And then it isn't. And you lie there, and you breathe, and you do what you have been doing every morning for 8 weeks, which is remind yourself that you are still here, that the day is going to happen whether you participate in it or not, that Bernard would have wanted you to get up and make your coffee and face it. So I got up. I made my coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the house we had shared for 23 years, and I looked at his chair across from me, the one with the slightly worn armrest where he always rested his left elbow, the one I had not been able to move or replace or even turn a different direction because moving it felt like agreeing to something I was not ready to agree to, and I drank my coffee, and I talked to him the way I had been doing every morning. I told him about the appointment. The will reading was that afternoon. Bernard's lawyer, a man named Arthur Simmons who had handled our legal affairs for 15 years and whom I had always liked, had called to schedule it 2 weeks after the funeral. Routine, he had said. Just a formality. Come in at 2 o'clock and we'll go through everything together. Bernard was organized about these things. He had always been organized. It was one of the qualities I loved most about him, the way he handled the practical architecture of a life with quiet efficiency so that I never had to worry about it. I trusted that. I had always trusted that. I finished my coffee. I got dressed. I drove to Arthur's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March telling myself it was a formality. Just paperwork. The last administrative task of grief before the real work of rebuilding could begin. I walked into the conference room, and there were 2 people sitting at the table whom I had never seen before in my life. A woman. And 2 teenagers. I looked at them. They looked at me. And Arthur Simmons, who had handled our legal affairs for 15 years and whom I had always liked, could not look at me at all. I want to tell you what I did in that moment, but I am not entirely sure I can. I know I sat down. I know I set my bag on the table with the specific, careful deliberateness of a person whose body has understood something that her mind is still 3 steps behind. I know I looked at the woman. She was perhaps 45, dark hair, the careful, composed expression of someone who had been preparing for this meeting for a very long time. And I know I looked at the teenagers, a boy and a girl, perhaps 16 and 14, who both had eyes that I recognized. I recognized their eyes. I had been looking at those eyes across a dinner table for 23 years. And I understood. Before Arthur said a single word, before he cleared his throat and opened his folder and began the specific, terrible work of explaining to me what the document in front of him said and who the people across the table were and what my husband of 23 years had been doing for 14 of them, I understood. My name is Lenora, and I am going to tell you the truth about Bernard. All of it. The part 1 discovered in that conference room. The part 1 discovered in the weeks after when I started looking, really looking, the way you look when the floor has already dropped out and there is nothing left to protect, at the 23 years I thought I had, and what they actually were. The part that broke me. And the part, slow and hard and still in progress, that is putting me back together. I am not all the way back yet. I want to be honest about that. I am not going to stand here and tell you I have arrived somewhere clean and resolved, that the story has a tidy ending, that Lenora is okay now. I am not okay yet. I am getting there. And I have found in the getting there that telling the truth out loud is one of the only things that actually helps. So that is what I am going to do. Stay with me. Because what Bernard did was not just a betrayal of me. It was the construction of an entire alternative life. And I deserve to know about it. So do you? Before I go any further, drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I want to know who is in this room with me today. Because I have a feeling this story is going to find the people who need it most, and I want to know where in the world they are. And if what you just heard made your breath catch, if you felt it, that cold drop in the stomach, that recognition of something too close to home, like this video right now. And if you are not already subscribed, do that before we go any further. Because I have been quiet about Bernard for long enough. I am done being quiet. Let me tell you about Bernard first. Because you cannot understand what was taken from me without understanding what I thought I had. And you cannot understand what I thought I had without understanding the man I believed Bernard Eugene Cole to be for 23 years. Bernard was 64 years old when he died. Heart attack. Sudden, which the doctors told me was actually a mercy, that a man with the degree of arterial blockage they found during the autopsy had been living on borrowed time for years, and that the end, when it came, had been fast. I am supposed to find comfort in that. On my better days I do. He was a project manager for a commercial construction firm. 32 years with the same company, which tells you something about the kind of man he presented himself as: steady, reliable, the kind of person organizations depend on because they know he will be there. He was good at his job. His colleagues came to the funeral in numbers that moved me. Men and women who had worked beside him for decades and who said things about Bernard that confirmed everything I believed about him. That he was fair. That he kept his word. That if Bernard told you something was going to get done, it got done, and you never had to check behind him. He kept his word. I have thought about that a great deal since March.
Met Bernard in 1999.
I was 38 years old, which meant I had arrived at the meeting with the particular clarity of a woman who is old enough to know what she wants and experienced enough to know what she does not. I had been engaged once before, in my early 30s, to a man named Douglas who was charming and unreliable in equal measure, and whose unreliability had taken me 3 years longer than it should have to fully accept. When that ended, I spent 2 years being deliberately, intentionally alone, not lonely alone, there is a difference, and rebuilding my understanding of what a good relationship actually looked like as opposed to what I had been willing to settle for. By the time I met Bernard at a mutual friend's dinner party in the fall of 1999, I had a list. Not a literal list. I had never written it down. But in my mind, in the accumulated clarity of 38 years and 1 broken engagement and 2 years of deliberate solitude, I knew what I was looking for. Steadiness. Honesty. The kind of man who said what he meant and meant what he said. The kind of man whose life, when you looked at it closely, held together. Whose stories matched his actions, whose past confirmed his present, whose word was a thing you could build on. Bernard appeared to be all of those things. He was not flashy. Not the kind of man who dominated a room or performed his own attractiveness. He was medium height, broad-shouldered. With reading glasses he was always misplacing, and a laugh that arrived slowly, like it had to travel from somewhere deep, and that when it finally got there made you feel like you had genuinely earned it. He was a reader. He cooked on Sunday mornings, elaborate breakfasts that took 2 hours and require more dishes than seemed reasonable for eggs and toast, but that tasted like the kind of food that makes you understand why people bother. He was good with my nieces and nephews in the unself-conscious way of a man who genuinely likes children rather than performing the liking of them for an audience. He had been married once before. A brief marriage in his late 20s, he told me, to a woman named Patricia, that had ended mutually and without acrimony after 2 years. No children. He spoke about it with the calm equanimity of someone who had processed it fully and moved on. I appreciated that. I had known men who spoke about their exes with either too much bitterness or too much lingering warmth, and both felt like unfinished business. Bernard seemed genuinely finished with that chapter, ready for the next one. We were married in 2001. A small wedding. 40 people. My sister Claudette was my maid of honor, and she gave a toast that made the room laugh and then cry, and that I have on a video somewhere that I have not been able to watch since March, and that I am not sure I will ever be able to watch again. Bernard's best man was his college friend Wendell, who is one of the people I have had to significantly reconsider since the conference room, for reasons I will get to. We bought the house on Sycamore Court the following year. A 4-bedroom colonial that was more house than 2 people needed, but that Bernard said we should grow into rather than out of, which I took at the time as a reference to children, and which I now understand may have meant something else entirely. We never had children, not from lack of wanting, but from the particular grief of trying and being told by doctors that my body was not going to cooperate, a grief that Bernard sat with me through in the way I needed him to, quietly, and without making me feel like a disappointment, without ever suggesting that this changed anything between us. That is the thing I come back to most. The kindness. Bernard was genuinely kind to me. Over 23 years, in the daily accumulated texture of a shared life, he was kind. He remembered things. He noticed when I was struggling before I said so. He drove 4 hours each way to sit with me when my mother had her surgery, even though he had a work deadline that week, and never once mentioned the sacrifice. He made the elaborate Sunday breakfasts. He held my hand at the movies even after 20 years. He told me I was beautiful on ordinary Tuesdays when there was no occasion for it and no audience. He was kind. And he was lying. Not about everything. That is the thing I have had to make my peace with, the thing that makes this specific betrayal harder in some ways than a betrayal that is total, that is clean, where the person turns out to have been a performance from the beginning with nothing real underneath. Bernard was not a performance. The kindness was real. The Sunday breakfasts were real. The 4-hour drive was real. The hand-holding was real. And so was she. Her name is Vanessa. I know her name now. I know a great deal about her now that I did not know in the conference room, things I have learned in the months since through the investigation I conducted with the specific focused energy of a woman who has decided that she is going to know the full truth of her own life, even if the knowing destroys her.
It has not destroyed me.
It has come close. Vanessa is 46 years old. She lives in a suburb 40 minutes from my house, the house on Sycamore Court, the house Bernard and I bought in 2002 and talked about growing into. She has been there for 11 years. Before that, she lived closer, in an apartment in the city, for the 3 years before that. 14 years total. Bernard had been with Vanessa for 14 of the 23 years he was married to me. He met her, as best I can reconstruct, in 2009. 2009. I want you to sit with that number. 2009 was the year my mother died. It was the year I was promoted to director at the nonprofit where I had worked for a decade. It was the year Bernard and I took a trip to Portugal that I have always remembered as one of the best of my life. 2 weeks in Lisbon and the Algarve. Long dinners and long walks, and the specific warmth of a couple who have been together long enough to be comfortable in silences, and who have not yet, as far as I knew, become strangers. 2009. He came home from Portugal and went back to his life. Both of his lives. The children are named Marcus and Deja. Marcus is 16. Deja is 14. They have Bernard's eyes. I told you I recognized them in the conference room, and I meant it literally, the specific shape of them, the particular darkness, the way they sat in their faces with the same quality his had. That direct, steady gaze that I had fallen in love with at a dinner party in 1999, and that looked back at me from across a conference room table in March, and told me everything I needed to know before Arthur Simmons said a single word. Bernard's children. I did not know they existed. Not a hint. Not a suspicion. Not a moment in 14 years where something snagged, where a story didn't quite line up, where the particular vigilance that women develop when something is wrong activated itself, and said, look closer. I have asked myself why. I have asked myself that question every day since March with the specific self-interrogating intensity of a woman trying to understand not just what happened, but how. How do you live beside someone for 23 years and not know? How do you share a bed and a table and a life and the intimate daily accumulation of knowing another person and miss something this large? The answer I have arrived at, slowly and with considerable resistance, is this. I did not miss it because I was naive. I did not miss it because I was inattentive or trusting to the point of foolishness or any of the other explanations that position the deceived person as somehow responsible for the quality of the deception practiced against them. I missed it because Bernard was very, very good at this. And because he had structured our life specifically and deliberately to make it missable. The work travel. Bernard traveled for work regularly, 2, sometimes 3 times a month, overnight stays in cities where projects were in various stages of completion. I had never questioned this because it was consistent with his job, with the kind of work he did, with the pattern of his professional life that had existed before me, and that I had simply accepted as part of the texture of being married to him. Project managers travel. This was known. What I did not know was that a significant portion of that travel was 40 minutes away. In a suburb I had never had reason to visit. In a house where 2 children were growing up who had their father's eyes. Arthur Simmons cleared his throat twice before he spoke. I noticed that. I notice everything now. The before and after of my attention are not the same thing. The woman who sat in that conference room in March processes the world differently than the woman who drove to it. And one of the ways she processes it differently is that she notices the small physical things people do when they are about to say something they have been dreading. The double throat clear. The way Arthur's hands moved to the folder, and then away from it, and then back. The way he had positioned himself at the head of the table rather than beside me where he had always sat in our previous meetings, which I understood, later, was not an accident. That he had placed himself equidistant between the two sides of the table because he had known, walking into this room, that there were two sides. There had always been two sides. I just had not known I was on one of them. "Lenora," he said. "Thank you for coming. Before we begin, I want to introduce." "I know who they are," I said. I did not know their names. I did not know the details. But I knew what I was looking at, and I was not going to sit in that room and perform ignorance for the sake of anyone's comfort, including my own. Arthur looked at me, and then he nodded. A small nod, the nod of a man who has just been relieved of one difficult task and understands that the remaining ones are not going to be easier. "Vanessa Mercer," he said, gesturing toward the woman. "And her children, Marcus and Deja." Vanessa looked at me directly when Arthur said her name. I will give her that. She did not look at the table or the window or anywhere that was not my face. She looked at me with a composed, careful expression of someone who had prepared for this moment, who had known it was coming in a way I had not, who had perhaps been waiting for it, in some form, for a long time. She was not crying. She was not apologetic. She was not performing anything in either direction. She just looked at me. The renovation of the back garden that had been a conversation for 6 years. The joint savings accounts were divided. 60% to me. 40% to a trust established for Marcus and Deja Mercer. I sat with that. 60-40. Bernard had looked at 23 years of our shared financial life and had decided that 40% of it belonged to the second family he had been running alongside it. His life insurance policy had been updated in 2019, 5 years before his death. The beneficiary designation had been changed from me alone to a split, 70% to me, 30% to Vanessa Mercer. I had not known about the update. I had not been told. The policy was in Bernard's name. He had the right to change the beneficiary designation without informing me. I know that now. I did not know it in the conference room. In the conference room, I simply heard Arthur read the number and felt it land in the specific way that financial betrayal lands when it arrives alongside every other kind, not as a separate wound but as confirmation of the first one, as evidence that the double life had been double in every direction, not just emotionally, not just physically, structurally, financially. In the documents, Bernard had been maintaining 2 families, and he had been planning, for at least 5 years before his death, for both of them to be provided for after he was gone. There was more. A property. I did not know about the property. It was not in both our names. Of course it was not. I would have known. I would have had to sign. It was in Bernard's name alone. Purchased in 2014 with money I could not immediately account for, and that I would spend the following months tracing through financial records I had never had reason to examine. A house in the suburb 40 minutes away, where Vanessa had lived for 11 years, where Marcus and Deja had grown up, where Bernard had spent a portion of every month for 14 years in the parallel version of the life, where Bernard had spent a portion of every month for 14 years in the parallel version of the life. He was also living on Sycamore Court. The property was left in full to Vanessa Mercer. Arthur finished reading. The room was very quiet. I want to tell you what I said next, but the truth is I did not say anything for a very long time. I sat in that chair, and I looked at the folder in front of Arthur, and I breathed with the specific shallow deliberateness of a woman who understands that if she breathes any deeper, she is going to come apart entirely in a room full of people she does not know, and she is not going to do that. She is not going to give this room that. What I was thinking, and I remember this with a clarity that still surprises me, that the thoughts were so specific and so ordered in a moment when everything else was chaos. What I was thinking was about the Portugal trip. 2 weeks in Lisbon and the Algarve. Long dinners and long walks. The specific warmth of a couple who have been together long enough to be comfortable in silences. 2009. The year he met her. We had come home from Portugal, and I had unpacked my suitcase and done the laundry and gone back to my life with the warm, settled feeling of a woman who has just spent 2 weeks with a man she loves and who is looking forward to the ordinary resumption of the life they share. And Bernard had unpacked his suitcase. and called her. Or perhaps she had called him. Or perhaps by 2009, the calls had become routine enough that there was no particular call, just the ordinary maintenance of a life he had already been living long enough that Portugal was simply an interruption in it. I looked up from the folder. I looked at Vanessa. "How long did you know he was married?" I said. The room stilled. Vanessa looked at me steadily. And she said, with the specific, careful honesty of a woman who had also, clearly, been sitting with this question for a very long time and had arrived at an answer she was not proud of. "From the beginning," she said. I nodded. I looked back at the folder. I had one more question, but I did not ask it in that room. I was not going to ask it in that room with Arthur and his double throat clear and two teenagers looking at their hands. I was going to ask it later, in the privacy of my own processing, in the slow, terrible work of understanding a 23-year marriage from the outside in. The question was this: did he love me? I have not answered it yet. I am not sure I ever will. I picked up my bag. I stood up. I looked at Arthur and I told him I would be in touch, and I walked out of that conference room and down the corridor and through the glass doors of his office and into the parking lot, and I sat in my car, and I did not drive for 45 minutes. I just sat. And I thought about Bernard's chair with the worn armrest, and the Sunday breakfasts, and Portugal. And I thought, who are you? I thought that for a long time. I am, in some ways, still thinking it. I did not go home immediately after the parking lot. I drove. Not to anywhere specific, just drove, the way you do when the inside of your own house feels like a place you are not yet ready to be, when the chair with the worn armrest and the Sunday breakfast dishes and the 23 years of accumulated domestic evidence of a life you thought you understood is waiting for you, and you need another hour before you can face it. I ended up at my sister Claudette's. I had not called ahead. I pulled into her driveway at 5:30 in the afternoon and sat in the car for a moment and then rang the bell, and when she opened the door and looked at my face, she did not ask a single question. She just stepped back and let me in and went to the kitchen and made tea and brought it to the couch and sat beside me and waited. That is Claudette. I told her everything in the order it had happened. The conference room. Arthur's throat clear. Vanessa looking at me directly. The 60-40 split. The life insurance update. The property 40 minutes away. The children with Bernard's eyes. Claudette listened to all of it without interrupting, which is not her natural mode. Claudette is a woman of opinions and she delivers them promptly, but she understood, I think, that what I needed in that moment was not opinions. What I needed was a witness. Someone to hear it so that it was real. So that the conference room was not something that had happened only inside my head, something I could wake up tomorrow and discover had been a particularly vivid and terrible dream. When I finished, she put her hand over mine, and she said, very quietly, "What do you need?" "I need to understand," I said. She nodded. "Then we're going to understand," she said. "Claudette is a retired accountant. I want you to hold on to that, because it becomes relevant." I went home that night. I walked into the house on Sycamore Court, and I looked at Bernard's chair, and I looked at the kitchen where he had made Sunday breakfasts, and I looked at the bookshelf with his books still exactly where he had left them, because I had not been able to move anything, and I stood in the middle of the living room, and I said, out loud, to the empty house, "Show me." Not to Bernard exactly. Not a conversation. More like a decision. A declaration to the house and the furniture and the 23 years of accumulated objects that I was going to look now. Really look. With the eyes of a woman who knows what she is looking for rather than the eyes of a woman who trusted what she saw. I started with the finances. Bernard had always handled our finances. Not in a controlling way. Not in the way that I have since read about, the deliberate financial isolation that is a form of abuse, but in the way of a man who is organized and who is good at it, and who would simply, over time, become the person in our household who managed these things. I had access to all our accounts. I had always had access. I had simply, for 23 years, trusted that what I saw when I occasionally looked was the complete picture. It was not the complete picture. I sat down at Bernard's desk, the desk in the study where he had paid bills and managed investments and done the quiet administrative work of our shared financial life for 23 years, and I opened his laptop and I started from the beginning. His email first. Bernard had 2 email accounts. I had known about one of them. His primary address, the one he had used for 20 years, The one where his work emails and our joint correspondence and the newsletters from the bookstore he liked and the confirmations from the restaurant reservations he made, all of it lived there, and I had, occasionally over the years, sent things to that address or seen it on his screen without any particular attention. The second address I found in his browser history. A Gmail account. Created in 2009. The address was a variation of his name, not his full name, a shortened version, the kind of address that would look entirely unremarkable to anyone who saw it in passing, that would not announce itself as significant, that was designed to be seen and not noticed. I opened it. He had not logged out. I want to pause here because I think the detail matters. Bernard had not logged out of this account on his laptop. Whether this was carelessness or something else I have gone back and forth on. Whether he had simply forgotten, in the way that people forget things on their home computers when they feel safe, or whether some part of him had left it open on purpose. I do not know. I open it, and I read. I am not going to reproduce what I found there in detail because some of it belongs to a privacy I am not willing to entirely dismantle even now. Even in this telling, even with everything, what I will tell you is the shape of it. 14 years of correspondence. Not constant, not the frantic, urgent emails of a new affair, but the settled, domestic, entirely normalized communication of a man managing a second life. Logistics. Scheduling. The particular language of two people who have been together long enough that the emails read less like love letters and more like the ordinary coordination of a shared existence. Marcus's school schedule. Deja's pediatric appointments. A conversation about the water heater in the house 40 minutes away, and whether to replace it or repair it. A birthday dinner reservation. His birthday. Bernard's birthday. The same birthday I had been celebrating with him every year. The dinner I made at home because he always said he preferred home cooking to restaurants. He had a birthday dinner reservation in 2019 at a restaurant I had never been to with a woman I had not known existed and two children I had not known were his. I sat at that desk for 4 hours. I read everything. When I finished, I closed the laptop and I sat in the dark of the study, and I thought about the water heater conversation, about the specific domestic mundanity of it, the back and forth about repair estimates, Bernard's recommendation of a particular brand, the easy familiarity of two people making a household decision together. He had been making household decisions in 2 houses simultaneously for 14 years. The bills arrived the next morning. Not literally, I began, with Claudette's help, the process of going through Bernard's financial records in the way that a retired accountant and a woman who has decided she is going to know the full truth of her own life go through financial records. Thoroughly. From the beginning. With the specific, methodical patience of people who understand that money always tells the truth even when people don't. What we found took 3 weeks to fully map. Bernard had a second bank account. Not joint, sole. At a different institution from our joint accounts and his primary personal account, at a credit union he had joined in 2009, the same year, always the same year, that received a regular transfer from his paycheck through a direct deposit split I had never noticed because I had never looked at his full paycheck, only at the amounts that arrived in our joint account. The amount going to the second account varied over the years. In the early years it was modest. Enough for an apartment, utilities, the ordinary expenses of a person living alone. As the years went on and Marcus was born, and then Deja, and the apartment became the house 40 minutes away, the amount grew. By the last 5 years of Bernard's life, he had been transferring consistently between $4,000 and $6,000 a month to the account I had not known existed. $4,000 to $6,000 a month. For years. I want to be precise because precision matters here. We were not a wealthy household. We were comfortable. Bernard made a good salary, and I had worked for 30 years at the nonprofit, and we had saved carefully and lived within our means, and the retirement we had planned, the Japan trip we kept deferring, the garden renovation that was always almost happening, were all within reach. Comfortable. Not wealthy. $4,000 to $6,000 a month was not invisible money. It was money that should have been visible. That would have been visible if I had ever looked at the full picture rather than the portion of the picture Bernard had arranged for me to see. Claudette sat across from me at my kitchen table on the 3rd week of this, and she looked at her notes, and she looked at me, and she said, with the quiet precision of a woman who has spent 40 years in numbers, "Lenora." Over the last 10 years alone, conservatively, he moved approximately $500,000 through that account. I looked at her. $500,000, she said. Not cruelly. Just clearly. $500,000. Built from the same income that had built our joint savings. The same career. The same paychecks. The same 32 years with the same company that his colleagues had praised at his funeral. The men and women who had said Bernard kept his word. Bernard could be counted on. If Bernard told you something was going to get done, you never had to check behind him. He had been very good at being counted on. In both directions. The calendar was the last thing I looked at. Bernard had kept a paper calendar, a large desk calendar, the kind with a page for each month, that he filled in with his careful architectural handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had spent his career producing schedules and timelines and who brought that same precision to his personal life. He had kept one every year for as long as I had known him, and I had never paid it particular attention because it was simply Bernard's calendar, his work appointments and personal notes, the private scheduling infrastructure of a man who was organized. I went back through 10 years of calendars. He had kept them all, filed in the bottom drawer of the desk in the study, in order, going back to 2012. I sat on the floor of the study, and I went through them one by one. The work trips were all there. The overnight stays, the city names, the project codes I recognized from years of half-listened-to-dinner conversation. Chicago, Dallas, Philadelphia. The infrastructure of a 32-year career spread across the pages in his careful handwriting. And then there were the others, not labeled as work, not labeled as anything which was itself the label. Blank days. Days with a small mark in the corner. A dot. Just a dot, the kind of notation that would mean nothing to anyone who did not know what it meant. Regular. Consistent. Averaging, across the years, 2 to 3 times a month. I counted the dots in the 2019 calendar. 31. 31 days in 2019 that Bernard had been 40 minutes away. In the house with the water heater they had decided together to replace. With the children who had his eyes. I closed the last calendar, and I sat on the floor of the study in the house on Sycamore Court, and I thought about what it means to share a life with someone. The fundamental premise of it, that the person beside you is who they appear to be, that the life you are building together is the life they are also building, that the intimacy of years of daily proximity means you know someone in a way that cannot be faked. Bernard had faked it. Not all of it. I have said that, and I will keep saying it because it is true, and because the truth, even the complicated parts of it, matters more than a clean narrative. Not all of it was fake. The kindness was real. The hand-holding was real. The 4-hour drive when my mother had her surgery was real. But the exclusivity was fake. The wholeness was fake. The version of Bernard that I had, faithful, singular, mine, was fake. And I had 31 dots in a paper calendar and $500,000 and a Gmail account created in 2009 and 2 children with his eyes to prove it. The attorney's name was Patricia Osei. I want to acknowledge the coincidence of that name because I noticed it myself and because this story has enough strange symmetries in it that one more feels appropriate. Patricia. The name of Bernard's first wife. The brief marriage in his late 20s that had ended mutually and without acrimony. The finished chapter he had described with such convincing equanimity at the beginning of our relationship. I have since wondered about Patricia. About whether the equanimity was as complete as it appeared, about whether she knew things about Bernard that I did not, and whether, if I had somehow found her before I married him, she would have told me. About whether the finished chapter was finished in the way Bernard had described or finished in some other way that I was not given the information to evaluate. I will probably never know. Patricia Osei was 56 years old, an estate and family law attorney with a practice in the city, recommended by Claudette, who had used her for her own estate planning 3 years earlier, and who called her the morning after our kitchen table session with the calendars and the $500,000 and said, simply, "My sister needs you." Patricia saw me within 48 hours. I arrived at her office with everything. The financial records Claudette and I had assembled. The calendar copies I had made. The screenshots from the Gmail account. The will as Arthur Simmons had read it. The life insurance documentation I had requested from the provider. The property records I had pulled for the house 40 minutes away. Everything in a folder that was, by the time I sat across from Patricia Ose, 73 pages. Every page was a year of my life. Patricia read in silence. When she finished, she set the folder down and looked at me with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who has been practicing law long enough to have stopped being surprised by the things people do to each other, and who has learned to channel what might otherwise be outrage into the cleaner, more useful energy of strategy.
Tell me what you want, she said.
Not what happened. Not how are you feeling.
What do you want?
I had thought about that question in the 48 hours between Claudette's call and this meeting. I had thought about it on the floor of the study and in the sleepless hours of the 2 nights between, and on the drive to Patricia's office that morning. What do you want, Lenora? Not what did you lose, not what was taken, not what was done to you. What do you want? I want to understand what I'm entitled to, I said. And then I want to make decisions from there. Patricia nodded. The nod of a woman who respects a clear answer. All right, she said. Let me tell you what the law says.
What the law said was this.
The house on Sycamore Court was mine. Not contested, not complicated, jointly owned. His half passed to me under the terms of the will. The house was mine entirely, and without dispute. That was the simple part. The joint savings accounts were more complicated. Bernard had the legal right to designate the distribution of his portion of jointly held assets in his will. The 60-40 split was, Patricia told me carefully, within the bounds of what he was permitted to do. Contesting it was possible. There were arguments available, particularly around the question of whether assets accumulated during the marriage had been improperly diverted to support a second household, which could constitute a form of marital waste. But contesting it would require a legal process that was not fast, not inexpensive, and not guaranteed. What are my chances?
I said.
Of recovering the full amount he left to the trust? Patricia paused. Moderate. The marital waste argument is strongest given the financial records you have. The documented transfers over 14 years are significant, and a court could look favorably on the argument that joint marital assets were used to fund a parallel household without your knowledge or consent. But it is not a certainty, and it will cost you time and money to find out. And the life insurance? Patricia's expression shifted slightly. Just slightly. The shift of a person who is about to tell you something they know you do not want to hear. The life insurance designation is very difficult to contest, she said. Bernard had the unilateral right to name his beneficiaries and to change them. The 30% to Vanessa Mercer was his legal choice to make, and it was made correctly. The forms were properly executed. The designation was valid. To successfully contest it, you would need to prove undue influence or lack of capacity at the time of signing, and given that the change was made in 2019 when Bernard was in good health, and the documentation is clean, she paused. It is not the fight I would recommend. I sat with that. The money going to Vanessa from the life insurance policy was, in all likelihood, going to remain with Vanessa. The law had no interest in the moral architecture of why Bernard had made that choice. The law cared about whether the forms were filled out correctly. They were filled out correctly. Bernard had always been organized. What about the property? I said. The house 40 minutes away. His sole property, left to Vanessa in the will. That is straightforward. He owned it, he left it to her. The bequest is valid.
A pause.
What is not straightforward is how he purchased it. If the down payment or subsequent costs came from joint marital assets, that is where your marital waste argument is strongest. Do you have documentation of the purchase? I had pulled the property records. I slid them across the desk. Patricia looked at them. She looked at the purchase date, 2014. She looked at the price. She looked at me. Do you have her joint financial records from 2014? She said. Claudette is pulling them. I said. Good. She made a note. This is where I think we have the most traction. If we can demonstrate that joint marital funds were used to purchase a property that was then left entirely to a third party, we have a strong argument for recovery. Not of the property itself. The bequest of his sole property is valid, but of the equivalent value from the estate. I nodded. How long? I said. Patricia looked at me steadily. If we pursue the full case, marital waste, joint asset recovery, the property purchase, 12 to 18 months. Possibly longer if it goes to trial rather than settling. I looked at the window behind Patricia's desk. Gray March sky. The the kind of sky that gives nothing away. And if I don't pursue it? I said. The will stands as written, she said. 60-40 on the savings. 30% of the life insurance to Vanessa. The property to Vanessa. You keep the house and your 40% and whatever individual assets were in your name. I sat with that for a long time. I had two choices. I could fight. I could spend 12 to 18 months in the legal system arguing over joint assets and property purchases and marital waste while grieving a marriage that I was only beginning to understand. I could win. Patricia thought the marital waste argument was strong and recover a portion of what Bernard had diverted. Or I could not fight. I could take what the will gave me and close the legal chapter and spend those 12 to 18 months doing something other than depositions and financial forensics. I could grieve. I could figure out who I was now and what came next. I looked at Patricia. If I fight, I said, who benefits most? She looked at me. Be honest, I said. A pause. The estate attorneys, she said. And potentially you if we win. But the margin between what you'd recover and what you'd spend getting there is not as large as it might look from the outside. I nodded. I thought about what I actually wanted.
Not what I was entitled to.
Not what the law could give me. What I, Lenora Cole, 61 years old, 8 weeks a widow, sitting in a chair in a law office on a gray March afternoon, actually wanted. I wanted my life back. Not the life I had had. That life was gone, unmade, revealed to have been something other than what I had believed it was. Not Bernard back. Bernard was dead, and even if he had not been, the Bernard I would be getting back was not the Bernard I thought I had lost. I wanted the next life, the one that came after. I wanted to stop spending myself on Bernard. I want to take what the will gives me, I said. And I want to pursue the marital waste claims specifically around the property purchase. Just that. If joint funds were used to buy that house, I want them acknowledged. Not because of the money. Because I want it on the record. Patricia nodded slowly. That I can do, she said. And it's a much narrower case.
6 months, probably.
Maybe less if they settle quickly. Will they settle? I said. When they see the financial records Claudette pulled, Patricia almost smiled. Yes. I think they will settle. She was right. They settled in 5 months. The amount recovered was not transformative. It was not the $500,000. That money was gone, spent over 14 years on a life I had not known existed, and no legal proceeding was going to give it back to me. What was recovered was the documented portion of the property down payment that Claudette had traced to our joint accounts. A specific, provable, documented amount. Not enough to change my financial life. Enough to put something on a record. Enough to say, I know what you did, Bernard. And someone official knows it too. That mattered to me. I will not pretend it did not. Vanessa called me in May. 2 months after the conference room. 6 weeks after I had retained Patricia and the legal process had begun its slow, documented march toward the settlement that was still months away. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang, a number I did not recognize, a local area code, and something made me answer it rather than let it go to voicemail. The instinct of a woman who has decided she is going to know everything and who has learned, in the 2 months since March, that not answering things is how you end up with 14 years of unanswered things. Lenora, she said. Just my name. No preamble. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed this call many times and had decided that the rehearsal was not going to help her and that the only way through it was directly. Vanessa, I said. A pause. I want to meet with you, she said. Not through the lawyers. Just the two of us. I understand if you don't want to. I understand if you never want to speak to me again. But I have things I need to say to you, and I would rather say them in person than have them end up in a legal document somewhere. I stood in my kitchen, and I looked at Bernard's chair with the worn armrest. And I thought about what I actually wanted. Not what I was supposed to want. Not the response that the situation seemed to call for. Anger, refusal, the righteous slamming down of a phone. The actual thing I wanted underneath all of it, underneath the grief and the forensics and the calendar dots and the $500,000 and the Gmail account and all the rest of it. I wanted to understand. I had always wanted to understand. When, I said, we met at a coffee shop on a neutral street, not in my neighborhood, not in hers. a place neither of us had a history with. Somewhere that did not belong to either version of Bernard's life. I arrived first. I sat at a corner table with my back to the wall, a habit I had developed since March, the habit of wanting to see the room, of not wanting to be approached from behind, and I ordered coffee, and I waited. Vanessa arrived 7 minutes after me. She was different outside the conference room. In the conference room, she had been composed, contained, the careful stillness of a woman in a formal and adversarial setting. Here she looked like what she was, a woman in the middle of grief, the specific untidy grief of someone whose loss cannot be publicly acknowledged, whose mourning has no official shape. She had lost Bernard too. Whatever else was true, she had also lost him. She sat down across from me. We looked at each other. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Not an uncomfortable silence. The silence of two people who have arrived at something significant and are taking a breath before they step into it. "Thank you for coming," she said finally. "You said you had things to tell me," I said. Not unkindly, but directly. She nodded. And then she told me. She had met Bernard in 2009. Not at work. At a community event, a fundraiser for a local school where Vanessa had been volunteering and Bernard had attended as a corporate sponsor representative for his firm. She had known he was married within the first month. He had told her. He had not pretended to be single, had not invented a story about a separation that wasn't happening or a divorce that was in progress. He had been direct about it. "I am married. I am not going to leave. I am not offering you that." She had stayed anyway. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I sat with it for a very long time in that coffee shop, and I have sat with it many times since. She had known. She had been told clearly. And she had made a choice, her own choice, with full information, to be in that relationship, to build a life inside it, to have children inside it. I asked her why. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something that I did not expect, and that I have turned over in my mind many times since. "I thought I was making a practical choice," she said. "I was 32 years old, and I had watched my mother stay in a miserable marriage for 30 years because she didn't think she had options, and I had decided I was never going to do that. I was going to make clear-eyed decisions about what I could have and be honest with myself about what I was accepting." A pause. And Bernard he was kind. He was consistent. He did what he said he was going to do. He showed up. Another pause. I told myself that was enough. That I could build something real inside what he was offering even if it wasn't everything. "And the children?" I said. A longer pause. "Marcus wasn't planned," she said. "And when I found out I was pregnant, I had to decide, and I decided I wanted him. Regardless of everything. I wanted my son." She looked at the table. "And then Deja came, and by then it was a family. It was my family. Whatever it was also." I looked at her. "Did you ever think about me?" I said. "Yes," she said. "Not at first. At first it was easier not to. But after Marcus, after he was born, and I understood what it actually meant to build a life with someone, what was at stake, yes. I thought about you." She paused. "I told Bernard after Marcus was born that I needed him to tell you. That I couldn't continue the way we were without you knowing. That it wasn't right." I was very still. "What did he say?" I said. "He said he would handle it," she said. "In his own time. In the right way. That he needed to find the right moment." A pause that had weight in it. He was still finding the right moment when he died. He was still finding the right moment. I sat with that. I had been with Bernard for 23 years, and he had been finding the right moment for 14 of them, and the moment had never come, and then he was dead, and the moment arrived in a conference room with Arthur Simmons and his double throat clear, and two teenagers looking at their hands. Bernard had handled it, in his own way, in his own time, which was, as it turned out, posthumously. I looked at Vanessa across the table, and I tried to locate what I felt toward her. I had thought about this. Had tried to prepare myself for it, for what it would feel like to sit across from the woman who had been in my husband's life for 14 years. I had expected anger. A clean, directed fury that had a target and a shape. The anger was there, but it was not clean. Because Vanessa was also a woman who had been told half the truth and had made her choices accordingly. who had asked Bernard to make it right and had been given the same answer I had been given about so many things over the years.
He would handle it.
"I'm not going to tell you I forgive you," I said. She nodded. She had not expected me to. "And I'm not going to tell you I understand your choices," I said. "Because I don't. I might someday. I'm not there yet." She nodded again. "But I need to ask you something," I said. "And I need you to answer it honestly." She looked at me. "Did he love you?" I said. The question I had not been able to answer for myself. The one I had been carrying since the parking lot outside Arthur's office. I was asking the person most likely to know. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment. "I think he loved us both," she said finally. "In the way that I think he had a very large capacity for love and a very small capacity for honesty. And I think he spent 23 years hoping that the love would be enough to make up for the dishonesty and that he never quite believed it was."
She paused.
"He carried it. You could feel it on him. The weight of it. Especially in the last few years. Did you ever feel like you had all of him?"
I said.
Vanessa looked at me for a long moment. "No," she said. "Never. Not once in 14 years." I nodded. We sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours. I cannot tell you that we arrived at anything clean. There was no reconciliation, no mutual absolution, no moment where the two of us looked at each other and the complicated mathematics of what Bernard had done resolved into something simpler. What happened was two women sitting in a corner booth with coffee going cold between them, sorting through the wreckage of the same man's choices, saying true things to each other because neither of us had anyone else to say them to who had been in the same room. When we stood to leave, she looked at me and she said,
"I'm sorry, Lenore."
"For my part in it, I know that doesn't fix anything." "It doesn't," I said. "I know." I looked at her for a moment. "How are the kids?" I said. Something moved across her face. Something that was relief and grief simultaneously, the expression of a woman who has been braced for a different kind of ending to this conversation and who was surprised by the one she got. "Struggling," she said. "They loved him." "I know," I said. And I did. I walked out of that coffee shop and I sat in my car and I did not cry. I had cried enough. What I felt was something I did not have a word for then, and that I have been searching for since. Not forgiveness. Not peace. What I felt was something I did not have a word for then, and that I have been searching for since. Not forgiveness. Not peace. Something that was simply the acknowledgement that there were multiple people in the wreckage of Bernard's choices, and that most of them had not chosen to be there. Vanessa had chosen. Bernard had chosen. The rest of us had simply been in the path of those choices. That was not nothing. And understanding it, even partially, even with all the complicated feelings that surrounded it, understanding it was the first thing that felt like movement, like the direction of forward rather than the direction of under. I drove home. I made dinner. I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked at Bernard's chair. And for the first time since March I thought, I am going to move that chair. Not yet. But soon. The chair stayed where it was for another 3 months. I want to be honest about that because I said soon and soon turned out to mean 3 months, and I think that is important to include the gap between the decision and the doing of it, the way grief does not move at the speed of insight, the way you can understand something fully and still need time before your body catches up to what your mind has accepted. I moved it in August. Not out of the house. Not to a different room. Just turned it slightly, away from directly facing my chair, so that when I sat at the kitchen table in the morning with my coffee, I was not looking at the exact angle of absence that Bernard had occupied for 23 years. A small adjustment. The kind that costs more than it looks like it should, and that matters more than it looks like it should. Claudette came over the day I did it. Not because I asked her, though I had told her I was thinking about it, but because Claudette has always had the specific attentiveness of a person who shows up before she is called, who reads the weather in a phone conversation, and appears at your door with food, and the willingness to sit in whatever the day requires. We ate in the kind of quiet that exists between people who have known each other their whole lives and do not need to fill it. That was a good morning. I had more of them as the months went on. Not consistently. Grief is not consistent. It does not build in a straight line from worse to better. It moves in the circular, revisiting way of something that has no interest in your preference for linear progress. There were mornings in September that were worse than mornings in April. There were Tuesday afternoons that arrived with the specific weight of the conference room and sat on my chest until I breathed through them. There were moments, in the grocery store, in the car, standing in the shower, when the full reality of what Bernard had been doing for 14 years arrived fresh, as if for the first time, and I had to stand inside it and wait for it to pass. I waited. It always passed. I went back to work in July, the nonprofit where I had spent 30 years. Director of community programs, the job I had been doing for a decade, the work that had always given me a sense of purpose that was separate from and prior to Bernard, and that was, I was grateful to discover, still there. Still mine. Still the thing I was good at and believed in, and that got me out of bed on the mornings when getting out of bed required a reason beyond the abstract. My colleagues had been generous during the months I was away.
Cards.
Food delivered to the house in those first weeks. The specific professional grace of people who give you space without making you feel abandoned. When I came back, there was no performance of normalcy, no awkward over-cheerfulness, no careful avoidance of any subject that might touch grief. Just work. The ordinary, purposeful, sometimes frustrating, sometimes genuinely moving work of running programs for people who needed them. I had forgotten how much I loved it. Bernard had never quite understood my work. Not dismissively, he had never been dismissive about it, but in the way of a man whose own professional life was organized around concrete outcomes, deliverables, timelines, things that could be pointed to and measured. The nonprofit world, with its slower metrics and its long view, and its work that sometimes took years to show visible results, had always been slightly opaque to him. He had supported it. He had been proud of me for it, but he had not fully understood it. I thought about that in July back at my desk, running a meeting about a program that had been in development for 8 months and was finally showing the results we had been working toward. I thought there was a whole part of me he did not understand. And I had spent 23 years making peace with that gap, rather than examining it. That was the beginning of a different kind of looking. Not at Bernard. I had done enough looking at Bernard. The investigation had given me the full picture, and the picture was clear, and there was nothing left to find that would change the fundamental shape of it. But looking at myself, at the marriage I had been in, at the choices I had made inside it, and what those choices said about what I had believed I was worth. Not self-blame. I want to be precise about that distinction because I think it matters enormously and because I have encountered, in the months since everything became public, a particular kind of response from people who hear this story and whose first instinct is to look for what the wrong party could have done differently. I am not interested in that analysis. I am not responsible for Bernard's choices. I did not cause them, enable them in any meaningful sense, or deserve them. But I was responsible for my own choices inside the marriage. For the times I had felt something and not said it. The times I had noticed the absence of something and filled the absence with a story I preferred over the question the absence was actually asking. The times I had chosen the harmony of not looking too closely over the possible disruption of looking fully. I had made those choices. Not because I was weak or unaware. Because I had loved Bernard, and loving someone, genuinely loving them, involves a degree of trust that makes you selective about where you apply your scrutiny. You do not surveil the people you love. You do not approach every inconsistency as evidence of a crime. You extend the benefit of the doubt because the alternative, living in a marriage as though it is an investigation, is not a marriage, it is a sentence. I had not been wrong to trust. I had been unlucky in who I trusted. That is the distinction I came back to over and over in the months of rebuilding. Not the distinction between smart and naive, not the distinction between vigilant and oblivious. The distinction between trusting well and being trusted well. I had done the first. Bernard had failed at the second. That was his failure, not mine. Claudette told me something in October that I have carried since. We were at her kitchen table. We had developed a rhythm by then of Sunday dinners. Just the two of us, the kind of regular scheduled time that grief requires and that Claudette had proposed, and I had accepted with more gratitude than I expressed in the moment. She had been watching me across the table and she said, with the directness that is simply Claudette's mode and that I have been grateful for my entire life, "You seem different." Different how? I said. She thought about it for a moment. More like yourself, she said. More like the version of you that exists when you're not managing something. I looked at her. Was I always managing something? I said. With Bernard? She picked up her fork.
Yes.
I think so. I think you were managing the gap between who he was and who you needed him to be for a long time without knowing that was what you were doing. I sat with that for the rest of the dinner and for several days after. The gap between who he was and who I needed him to be. I had been a good manager. I had managed it so efficiently that I had not known it was happening. I called Vanessa once more in November. Not for a long conversation. 5 minutes. I had been thinking about Marcus and Deja, about the 16-year-old with his hands rigid and the 14-year-old looking at her own hands in the conference room, and I had a question I needed to ask. How are they? I said. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, the pause of a person recalibrating to an unexpected call.
Better, she said.
Marcus started seeing a counselor. Deja has been. She processes things quietly, like her father. A pause. She asks about you sometimes. I was not prepared for that. What does she ask? I said. Whether you're okay, Vanessa said. She feels guilty. She's 14 and she feels guilty for existing, and I've been trying to help her understand that she has nothing to feel guilty about, but Vanessa paused. She's 14. I thought about Deja's hands in her lap. Tell her I'm okay, I said. Tell her none of this is her fault. Tell her. I stopped. Started again. Tell her I hope she's okay too. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Lenora, she said. I hung up. I sat in my living room with the phone in my hands, and I looked at the kitchen from where I was sitting. At the table. At the 2 chairs. At Bernard's chair, turned slightly, no longer facing mine at the exact angle of absence. And I felt something that I want to name carefully, because I think the naming of it matters. Not happiness. Not resolution. Not the clean, completed feeling of a story that has arrived at its ending. Something quieter than any of those things. Something that felt like the first morning of the rest of it. The specific quality of a day that is not good or bad, but simply open. That has not been decided yet. That contains, for the first time in a long time, the possibility of something other than what has already happened. I got up. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window with it, and I looked out at the garden, and I thought about the renovation we had always meant to do and had always deferred, and about whether I wanted to do it now for myself, in the way I wanted rather than the way we had discussed. I thought I might. I thought there were a great many things I might do now in the way I wanted, rather than the way we had discussed. That thought arrived without grief. For the first time, without grief. Bernard, I have been talking about you for a long time now. Longer than this video. Longer than the months since March. In some ways I have been talking about you, inside my own head, in the accumulated private monologue of a woman sorting through the evidence of her own life, since the moment I sat in Arthur's conference room and understood what I was looking at. I am going to say a few last things and then I am going to stop. Not because I am finished with the grief. I am not finished with the grief, and I have made peace with the fact that finished may not be a place I arrive at, that what I am working toward is not the absence of it but the ability to carry it without it being the only thing I am carrying. But because this is enough. Because you have taken enough of my time and enough of my energy and enough of the space inside my own mind, and I am reclaiming the rest of it. I do not hate you. I have tried, in the interest of honesty, to locate hatred, and I cannot find it in a pure form. What I find instead is something layered and complicated and still in motion. Grief for the marriage I thought I had, anger at the choices you made and kept making for 14 years, a sorrow for the version of you that apparently could not find a way to be honest with the people who loved you most, and underneath all of it, still, despite everything, the memory of the man who drove 4 hours when my mother had her surgery and held my hand at the movies after 20 years and made elaborate Sunday breakfasts that required too many dishes. That man was real. I am not going to let what you hid erase what was true. But I am also not going to let what was true excuse what you hid. Both things get to be true simultaneously. I have learned that this year. What I want you to know, what I need to say out loud before I close this, is this. I deserved the whole truth. Not eventually. Not posthumously, through a lawyer's conference room, surrounded by strangers. From the beginning, or as close to the beginning as honesty could have managed. I deserved a husband who looked at the life we were building and told me the truth about what else he was building. Who gave me the information I needed to make real choices about my own real life rather than choices made inside a version of reality he had curated for me. I deserved that. I did not get it. And I have had to grieve not just you, but the version of our life I thought we had, which is a different kind of grief, and in some ways a harder one, because you can mourn a person, there are rituals for that, there are words and forms and the particular communal architecture of loss that holds you while you grieve. But there is no ritual for mourning a marriage you have just discovered was not entirely what you believed it was. No language for the specific grief of a woman standing in her kitchen realizing that the life she thought she was living had edges she was not given access to. I had to build the ritual myself. I am still building it, but I am building it. And that, the building, the continued forward motion of a woman who was shattered in a conference room in March and who is still here, still getting up, still making coffee, still looking at the garden and thinking about what she wants to do with it, that is mine.
Entirely mine.
You could not take that, Bernard. Nobody can take that. To everyone who has stayed with me, drop a comment before you go and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I said it at the beginning and I mean it now more than I did then. I want to know where this story has reached. Because I think it reaches the people who need it and I want to know who you are and where you are and that you are okay. And I have one question for you. One question that I have been sitting with since March and that I do not have a clean answer to and that I think deserves to be asked out loud. If Bernard had told me the truth, in 2009, the year he met Vanessa, the year we came home from Portugal, if he had sat across from me at this kitchen table and told me everything, what do you think I would have done? What do you think you would have done? Leave your answer in the comments. Be honest. Because I have been honest with you, and I think you owe me that much in return. And if this story has sat with you, if any part of Lenora's year has found something in you that recognized it, that said, yes, I know that feeling, I know that particular quality of standing inside a truth you were not prepared for, share this video. Not for the numbers. For the person in your life who is sitting in their own conference room right now, or their own parking lot, or their own kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning trying to figure out how to get up and face the day. Help me find them. Subscribe because I have more stories to tell, and every one of them is true, and every one of them belongs to a woman who deserved better and who found, in the finding out, that she was stronger than the thing that tried to break her. I am Lenora. I am still here. I am standing at my kitchen window with my coffee, and I am looking at my garden, and I am thinking about what I want to do with it.